favorite platform, the New Lyceum for English Literature. This is Dr. J.K. Tiwari here, and in today's class we are going to discuss T.S. Eliot as a critic. T.S. Eliot as a critic, T.S. Eliot as a poet, T.S. Eliot as a dramatist. He is distinguished in several fields, and in his criticism there are only 4 phrases for which he is famous, and those 4 phrases are frequently asked in examinations. पहले हम देखते हैं what are the works of criticism written by T.S. Eliot. Then I'll come to those phrases and explain one by one. The first thing first, T.S. Eliot wrote about himself that he was a classicist in literature. He was a classicist in literature, and so was he in the field of criticism. He was a classical critic. Classical critic not in the neoclassical way, not in the way of neoclassical critics like Alexander Pope, like Samuel Johnson, like John Dryden. These were the neoclassical critics, and they were going ahead in the footsteps of Horace. And Mr. T.S. Eliot was a classical critic, but he was on the footstep of Mr. Aristotle. This is the difference between the classical, neoclassical and T.S. Eliot. Classicist in literature, royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. So we don't have to take anything from his religion, from his politics. We have to focus here on only his criticism, his critical theories, his principles, and his critical works. These are his critical works written during his lifetime: Tradition and Individual Talent, The Sacred Wood, Essay on Poetry and Criticism, and in that collection Hamlet and His Problems, one of the most famous essays, occur homage to John Dryden, Shakespeare and the Stoicism of Seneca, for Lancelot and Rose, Dante, selected essays, the use of poetry and the use of criticism, and after Strange Gods, Elizabethan essays, essays ancient and modern, poetry and drama, 3 Vices of Poetry, the Frontiers of Criticism, on Poetry and Poets, and to criticize the critic, that was published posthumously. These are the critical works written by Thomas Stearns Eliot, the Nobel Prize winner and the most famous poet of 20th century. Most famous poet of the 20th century, and he was not merely a poet, but like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, like Matthew Arnold, he was a poet critic. He had felt, he had experienced, and his feelings are expressed in the field of poetry. Right, these are the critical terms for which T.S. Eliot is more famous. His poetic theory, theory of impersonality, his tradition and individual talent, and objective correlative, unification of sensibility, and then dissociation of sensibility. These are the terms for which T.S. Eliot is famous, and now let's explain each term one by one. First thing first, theory of impersonality. The concept of theory of impersonality occurs in his essay Tradition and Individual Talent. Essay Tradition and Individual Talent was written in 1919, and later it was included in his critical in the collection of his critical essays under the title The Sacred Wood. Right, Sacred Wood in 1920, that was a collection of 20 essays, and out of 21 was Tradition and Individual Talent. The essay is also available in Eliot's selected prose and selected essays. Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum. This is a line from the essay. Here in the essay he talks about 2 things especially. He talks about tradition. What is tradition and what is theory of impersonality? According to T.S. Eliot, what is tradition? The meaning of the tradition that is written in the dictionary is not related to the criticism of Mr. T.S. Eliot. According to T.S. Eliot, tradition means pastness of the past. You have to be a traditionalist means you have to follow the footsteps of your predecessors, of your previous poets, right? Those poets who had written before your arrival as a poet must be considered, must be read, must be thought, and their reflections should appear in your poetry. That is tradition. You cannot be a poet without reading Shakespeare. You cannot be a poet without going through the text of Homer. You cannot be a poet without reading Virgil, without reading Homer, without reading Horace, without reading Juvenal, without reading Shakespeare, without reading Milton, without reading Dryden, without reading Wordsworth, without reading Pope, without reading T.S. Eliot. Right? These are the poets of the past. They are the tradition. And tradition must be followed in poetry. That is his theory of tradition. Right? That is his theory of tradition. Alright. Tradition is the historical sense, and these just see the background of your slide. There are a lot of poets. When you start writing, you are not alone, but there are several poets of the past who are in your mind, and when you start writing, they start leaving their reflection. That is the tradition. That is the historical sense. Tradition means historical sense, the pastness of the past, but also of its presence. Pastness of the past plus presence, both जो है दोनों मिलकर के बनते हैं what they formulate a tradition, right? That is the historical sense. Past works of art form an order or tradition in your mind, in your literature, in your poem. Past is irretrievable according to Salman Rushdie. But if you are a poet, if you are going to be a poet, if you consider yourself to be a poet, if you are going to practice in the field of poetry, then according to T.S. Eliot, you cannot be a poet without going to the past, without being inspired, without being taught by the previous poets. This is the historical sense. The past should be altered. You can't follow the traditional poets, you can't follow the past poets in toto, but you have to apply your mind as well. The past should be altered by the present as much as the present directed by the past. So according to T.S. Eliot, present and past are inseparable. You cannot separate them. One affects other. Past is affected by the present. Past should be altered by the present. Right? Past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. Past plus present make future. Present influences, past is altered by the present situation, by the present scenario, by the present condition, and by your individual talent. Tradition and then individual talent, and they are equals to a great poet. Who is great poet? How can you say Shakespeare was great without even reading Shakespeare? And if you want to be popular, if you want to be known as much as Shakespeare was known or Shakespeare is known, then you must be aware of Shakespearean works, you must be aware of Shakespearean style, you must be aware of Shakespearean language, you must be aware of Shakespearean culture, and even you must be aware of Shakespearean critics. That is tradition in the words of T.S. Eliot. I hope now it's clear. Pastness of the past. The past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. A poet must embody the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer. Right? T.S. Eliot was an American born in America, and he took the British citizenship in the third decade of the 20th century. And if you want to be a poet, then T.S. Eliot says that is starting from Homer to the present. All the poets must be in your mind. Means you are one, and one mind is occupied by thousands of poets. You cannot be alone. And if you cannot be alone, it means you don't have any personality. You have to sacrifice your personality. That is the theory of impersonality. Right? The whole of the literature of Europe from Homer should be in the mind of the poet. You should embody the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer if you want to be a great poet. Had I been there at the place of T.S. Eliot, I would have said that the whole of the literature of the world should be in your mind, starting from Vedas, starting from Rig Vedas or ancient classics to the present. सब कुछ होना चाहिए आपके माइंड में. And T.S. Eliot was such a poet. T.S. Eliot had studied Sanskrit. He had studied Eastern philosophy in the university, and he not only studied but he also applied classical theories. He also applied Sanskrit poetics in his poems. For example, read the poem The Wasteland, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Right? Total influence of classical. Right? T.S. Eliot is a great poet because he himself was a great follower of tradition. He had the historical sense and he adopted the historical sense while writing poetry, while writing literature. All right. The most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously. The most effective part of your literature is where the past poets, where the immortal poets appear. Right? Where the immortal poets appear, where the dead poets, where ancestors assert their immortality most vigorously. Right? Suppose that you have written a poem and you have given that poem to me for perusal. I have read poem and I say, this is very Wordsworthian poem. Have you stolen some lines from Wordsworth? Then you will say, no, but definitely I am influenced by Wordsworth. That is the tradition. Right? I will say this line appears like the line of Shakespeare from its sonnet number this, sonnet number that. Then you will say that no, I have not copied, but definitely I cannot be a poet without Shakespeare. This is the tradition. All right. What happens when a new work of art is created? It's something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art that preceded it. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. These are the lines from the essay Tradition and Individual Talent. Just no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. And not only poet, no man has his meaning alone. I cannot be a man. I have come from a generation. I have started wearing shirts because I have seen my father wearing such shirts. I have put goggles, specs on my eyes because I have seen people who had weak eyesight wearing glasses. This is my meaning. This is the way a person is created. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and the artists. Right? Without the past poets, without the past artists, without being influenced by the past poets and past artists, you cannot be a poet, you cannot be an artist. This is the theory of tradition by T.S. Eliot. You cannot value him alone. You cannot judge anybody. You cannot judge anybody. You cannot say that he is a bad poet. On what ground he is a bad poet? Then you will say that his poetry is very unique as compared to this, as compared to that, as compared to this. Right? Then you will be comparing, and without comparing, you cannot say that he is good or bad. As there is nothing either good or bad, thinking makes it so. Right? There is nothing either good or bad. but the comparison makes him so whether he is a great poet or not great poet, bad poet. No poet has his meaning alone. No artist of any art has his meaning alone. His meaning is comparative, and he has adhered the pastness of the past. Then he is great. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall cohere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created? It's something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. Right? Past is carried forward. It mixes with the present, and then it creates new. Don't be total copier. Don't be emulated. Don't mimic the past poets, but learn something from the past poets, and those past poets must be reflected in your poetry, must reflect in fact in your poetry, and then you can be a great poet. And now you can sense here that T.S. Eliot's theory of tradition must have been inspired from Matthew Arnold's touchstone method. Matthew Arnold says in his study of poetry that to judge a piece of poetry, you must compare those poems, those lines. किससे compare करना चाहिए? With the lines of Homer, Dante, Shakespeare and Milton. And here T.S. Eliot says that you cannot be alone, you cannot live alone. No artist of any art can live alone without the past poet. Alright? Without past, we are nothing. We are the descendants, and ancestors should not be forgotten. Ancestors should be there, and individual is made of those ancestors. Alright? Fine? Can I proceed now? Right. Next is theory of impersonality. Impersonal theory. What is impersonal? Impersonal means you don't have any meaning. Impersonal means you do not have any personality. A poet must be impersonal, must be totally objective, and that's what Keats had said, that the most unpoetical is poet. The most unpoetical being is a poet. That is theory of impersonality. Artistic creation is the process of depersonalization. You have to put away your personality from your work. That is the objectivity, that is the theory of impersonality. You cannot mix your whims, your idiosyncrasies, your sadness, your happiness in your poem. You must be impersonal, right? You must be impersonal. You can't shed your personality in your poem. That is impersonality. That is the theory of impersonal. Put your personality away from your work. That is impersonal theory. Artistic creation is the process of depersonalization, right? Personalization, the opposite of personalization is depersonalization. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. In fact, T.S. Eliot propounded this theory of impersonality against the Wordsworthian views of poetry, against the romantic views of poetry. For romantic, poetry was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it takes its origins from emotions recollected in tranquility. And T.S. Eliot outrightly rejected this Wordsworthian definition. T.S. Eliot says, no, poetry is not an escape from personality. Poetry is not the turning loose of emotion, but it is an escape from emotion. Right? For Wordsworth, emotion is everything. For T.S. Eliot, poetry is an escape of emotion. It is not expression of personality. Poetry must not reflect your personality, but poetry को क्या करना चाहिए? Poetry should be an escape from personality. You cannot be there. You cannot be there in your poem. और होना क्या चाहिए, इसी को बोलता है फिर आगे जाकर के ऑब्जेक्टिव कोरिलेटिव. You have to find out an object through which you can express your emotion. Poetry is not the turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. This is the statement of T.S. Eliot that appeared in his essay Tradition and Individual Talent. Impersonal poet has links with John Keats, who proposed a similar figure in the chameleon poet. Poet should be a chameleon. This is the chameleon. Chameleon is an insect that keeps changing its personality. रंग बदलता रहता है. And in the same way, a poet must be a chameleon. He should be a poet according to the purpose, according to the demand of the audience, according to the demand of the character. Right? Demand of the character. Shakespeare is writing a play. Shakespeare is not Macbeth. Macbeth has his own personality. Shakespeare cannot be Macbeth. That is the theory of impersonality. Let Macbeth grow. Let Hamlet grow. Let Shylock grow. Shakespeare cannot be everywhere. Right? This is the theory of impersonality. You cannot reflect your personality in your poetry. Right? That is the theory of impersonality. Right? Your personal perceptions, your whims, your idiosyncrasies, your feelings, your emotions should not be there. And कैसे होना चाहिए वहां पर? Then in another essay, T.S. Eliot talks about another concept, that is objective correlative. Objective correlative basically is a term taken from art, taken from the painting. And there was an American painter and poet, Washington Allston. Washington Allston was an American poet, painter, and he had coined the phrase, he had introduced the phrase objective correlative, and T.S. Eliot took this phrase from the field of painting and employed it in the field of poetry. Right? T.S. Eliot introduced the term in his essay Hamlet and His Problems. Hamlet and His Problems. Hamlet not as a play, but Hamlet as a character. That's why here he has used his, otherwise he would have used Hamlet and its problem. Right? T.S. Eliot is talking about Hamlet as a character. What is the problem of Hamlet? And on this ground, on the ground of objective correlative, T.S. Eliot describes the play Hamlet as artistic failure. Hamlet is a great man, but Hamlet is unable to express his emotions. Hamlet is unable to express his emotions. कैसे unable होता है? Because he could not find a particular way to express his emotions. He could not find a particular object so that he could express his emotions. Lady Macbeth in Macbeth, she could express her emotions, and she expressed her emotions through sleepwalking scene. But Hamlet was unable to do so. That's why on the ground of objective correlative, Hamlet was declared an artistic failure. Right? Hamlet was proven an artistic failure by T.S. Eliot. In the essay, Eliot was ostensibly reviewing two recent books on William Shakespeare's play, one by an American scholar, Elmer Edgar Stoll, and other by an English scholar, J.M. Robertson. This is the objective question for your examination. Right? Two books on Shakespeare were published, and T.S. Eliot was reviewing both the books, and during that revision, the concept of objective correlative occurred in his mind, and then he wrote the essay Hamlet and His Problems. What is objective correlative? T.S. Eliot describes the phrase objective correlative is an object. It is a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events which shall be the formula of that particular emotion that the poet feels and hopes to evoke in the reader. Right? Shakespeare, any poet, must find out a particular set of events, a particular set of chains, a particular situation, so that he could express the emotions, and not only express, but he could also evoke that emotion in the reader. That is objective correlative, right? Since poetry is not the turning loose of emotion, it is an escape from emotion. And if it is an escape from emotion, then how could a poet express his emotion? For this, T.S. Eliot says that he must find out an objective correlative, a set of chains, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events through which he could express his emotion, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, and then that particular emotion could be evoked in the reader, and then reader will tally his mind to the mind of the character, right? The only way of expressing emotion is by finding an objective correlative. In other words, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, right? A particular set of objects, situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion. And Shakespeare, in the classic example of Lady Macbeth, found this formula of expressing emotion, and in the field of Hamlet, Shakespeare failed to express the emotion, right? And that's why Shakespeare's Hamlet is an artistic failure. Hamlet and His Problems was the name of the essay, written in 1919, and here he borrowed the term objective correlative from American painter poet Washington Allston. And while he was reviewing two critical works on Shakespeare, one by an American, one by an Englishman, the idea of objective correlative came in his mind, and then he defined objective correlative. Objective correlative is a set of events, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion. Alright, this is the objective correlative as was told by Mr. T.S. Eliot in his essay, The Objective, in his essay Hamlet and His Problems. Right? And then the final phrase that is very important, that is dissociation of sensibility and unification of sensibility. Through the term dissociation of sensibility, T.S. Eliot criticizes neoclassical poetry and romantic poetry. And through the unification of sensibility, T.S. Eliot appreciates metaphysical poets and modern poets. What is sensibility and what is dissociation of sensibility? T.S. Eliot says that 18th century poets, especially Dryden, Pope and others, were men of intellect. There is no emotion at all, there is no feeling at all in 18th century poetry, in 18th century poems. They were men of learning, they were rational men, they were men of intellect, and they were men of principles. They followed particular formula, they followed particular rules. And when he comes to romantic poets, he says that for a romantic, feeling was all. There was no intellect, there was no rationality, there was no scientific temperament. They were not men of learning, like poets like Wordsworth was saying that poetry should be written in the language of common men. Subject matter of the poetry should be from the common man, right? He was emphasizing one sensibility, leaving another. 18th century poets emphasized one sensibility and left another. That is the dissociation of sensibility. And for him, for T.S. Eliot, it was John Donne, it was the metaphysical poets who assimilated both the sensibilities, emotions, feelings and rationalities. both were assimilated in metaphysical poetry, that is unification of sensibility. Unification of sensibility and dissociation of sensibility, this is the theory, right? Sensibilities are associated in unified in the metaphysical poets, and these sensibilities are disintegrated in 18th century and 19th century poetry, that is dissociation of sensibility. Now let's come to the fact. The essay The Metaphysical Poets was published as a preface, right? Was published as a preface, as a review of the J.Z. Grierson's edition of metaphysical lyrics and poems of 17th century. And T.S. Eliot had reviewed this work, and in the review he wrote the essay Metaphysical Poets. The Metaphysical Poets was written by whom? Written by T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot ने इसको लिखा है. All right. The Metaphysical Poets was first published as a review of J.Z. Grierson's edition of metaphysical lyrics and poems of the 17th century. क्यों भाई, क्यों नाराज हो गए? मशीन भी मशीन ही होती है. Metaphysical poets are mature poets, in the words of T.S. Eliot. They do not represent a digression from the mainstream of English poetry, but rather a continuation of art. Dr. Samuel Johnson had highly criticized the metaphysical poets, and in the words of Dr. Samuel Johnson, metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. And according to Samuel Johnson, metaphysicals were not following the footsteps of the previous poets of their predecessors of Elizabethan poets, and that's why metaphysicals were men of learning, and they were described very derogatively by Dryden and then by Dr. Samuel Johnson. They were nowhere in poetry, in the field of literature, before T.S. Eliot wrote the essay. And when T.S. Eliot wrote the essay Metaphysical Poets, he described the metaphysical poets as the mature poets. And he said, T.S. Eliot said that they didn't divert it from the route, but in fact they were going along the route. They were going along the route. Eliot argues that earlier poets such as John Donne and the metaphysical poets possessed a unique sensibility. What was that unique sensibility? To integrate thought, emotion and sensory experience seamlessly. John Donne possessed a unique sensibility, and what was that sensibility? That unique sensibility that allowed them to integrate thought, emotion and sensory experience seamlessly. They had a direct and immediate apprehension of thought, feeling it as intensely as they sensed the fragrance of a rose. उनके लिए थॉट को समझना और फ्रेग्रेंस लेना रोज के, दोनों में कोई डिफरेंस नहीं था. Eliot shows that Donne and other poets of 17th century were the direct and normal development of the preceding age. Normal and direct development थे preceding age के. They were not men of learning. In fact, they were the poets as other were. वैसे ही पोएट थे वो जैसे कि अदर पोएट्स थे, वहां पे कोई डिफरेंसेस नहीं थे. राइट, दे वर नॉट द पोएट्स as Mr. Dr. Johnson had described, but they possessed a unique sensibility, and that unique sensibility had the power to combine emotion, sensory experience and thoughts. That is the unification of sensibility. And Dryden said that Donne affects metaphysics. Dr. Samuel Johnson says that they were men of learning, they were showy people, and means Dryden and Johnson criticized them, and it was T.S. Eliot who defended the metaphysical poets like John Donne, like Abraham Cooley. क्यों डिफेंड किया है? फर्स्ट, देयर इज द elaboration of simile to the farthest possible extent, and this elaboration of simile to the farthest extent, it is known as metaphysical conceit. Right, to be met with frequently in the poetry of Dryden and Cooley, and such in the poetry of Donne and Cooley. And this elaboration of simile was not unique in the poetry of Donne and Cooley. Such metaphysical conceits were already there in the poems of Shakespeare. Secondly, there is the device that the development of an image by rapid association of thought requiring considerable agility on the part of the reader, that is a technique of compression. Metaphysical produce their effects by sudden contrast. Metaphysical poetry also characterizes Elizabethan dramatists like Shakespeare, Webster, Turner and Middleton. This suggests that Donne and Cooley and other poets belong to the Elizabethan tradition. They were not the path breaker, right? They were not bohemian. In fact, they were going along the route of Elizabethans, and on this ground, Mr. T.S. Eliot defended the metaphysical poets from the attacks of Dr. Samuel Johnson, right? And from this definition, from this defense, another theory germinates, and another theory germinates. उस पर हम next में आएंगे. Dr. Johnson has rightly pointed out that these poets were analytic, right? These poets were analytic. They were devoted to much analysis and dissection of particular emotional situations, but Dr. Johnson has failed to see that they could also unite into new wholes of the concepts they had analyzed, right? Dr. Johnson saw the right things but not in the right way. Dr. Johnson identified that metaphysicals were men of analysis. They were analytical poets. He was right. T.S. Eliot says that Dr. Johnson was right here, but Johnson failed to see their special capacity, their special ability to combine all these forces, and on this ground metaphysicals were defended by Mr. T.S. Eliot. All right, I hope everything अब आपको क्लियर हो गया होगा, कुछ कंफ्यूजन नहीं होगी. डॉक्टर जॉनसन ने मेटाफिजिकल पोएट्स को क्या कहा था? That is merely a reminder for you. I have discussed metaphysical poets in detail when I was dealing with Dr. Samuel Johnson as a critic. Dr. Samuel Johnson wrote the biographies of 52 poets under the title Lives of the Most Eminent English Poets. And in those 52 poets, one poet was Abraham Cooley, and in the life of Abraham Cooley, he defined metaphysical poets. And what did Dr. Johnson say? Dr. Johnson said that the metaphysical poetry, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Most heterogeneous ideas are put together. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. But Eliot says that to bring together heterogeneous ideas and compelling them into unity by the operation of the poet's mind is universal in poetry. This is the defense. Dr. Johnson said that metaphysical poetry क्या काम करती है? In metaphysical poetry, the most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together, means they are not suitable but they are imposed. And T.S. Eliot defends that, says that this is very true, that heterogeneous ideas are yoked together, and this is not new. Only metaphysicals hadn't done it. Before metaphysicals, it was very obvious and it was already practiced by several poets. The Mr. Dr. Johnson himself had used these heterogeneous ideas, and he himself had these heterogeneous ideas yoked together in his poems like The Vanity of Human Wishes. The force of Dr. Johnson's remark lies in the fact that in his view the metaphysical poets could only yoke by violence dissimilar ideas. They could not unite them or fuse them into a single whole. However, this is not a fact. Right? So here T.S. Eliot attacks Dr. Johnson's attack on metaphysical poetry. Right? Dr. Johnson was very much limited. He was very much biased. He was not neutral while evaluating, while discussing the metaphysical poetry. Right? Second one. A number of poets of this school have eminently succeeded in uniting heterogeneous ideas. Eliot quotes from Herbert, Cooley, Bishop King and other poets in support of his contention. Therefore, he concludes that metaphysical poetry cannot be differentiated from the poetry from other poetry by Dr. Johnson's definition. The fault which Dr. Johnson points out is not there, and the unity of heterogeneous ideas is common in poetry. Every poet does the same. Why only metaphysicals are criticized? Right? Samuel Johnson was biased. Samuel Johnson failed in his critical evaluation of metaphysical poetry. This was the statement of T.S. Eliot in his essay Metaphysical Poetry. Alright? Dr. Johnson's famous definitions of metaphysical poetry, and then sensibility. Unification of sensibility, dissociation of sensibility. I have already described. What is sensibility? By sensibility, Eliot does not mean feeling or the capacity to receive sense impressions. He means much more than that. By sensibility, T.S. Eliot means it is a synthetic faculty of the mind, a faculty which can amalgamate and unite thought and feeling, like Samuel Taylor called it secondary imagination. Sensibility has the power to unite, as secondary imagination had the power to fuse, right, to make something new, right? And in order to make something new, secondary imagination क्या काम करती थी? Fuses, dissipates the raw materials obtained from the primary imagination. Secondary imagination, that is sensibility. Here sensibility means a synthetic faculty, that synthetic faculty which can amalgamate and unite thoughts and feelings, and this is the unification of sensibility, thought and feelings, which can fuse into a single whole the varied and disparate, often opposite and contradictory experiences. The Elizabethans had such a sensibility. Such a sensibility was not only possessed by metaphysicals, but Elizabethans like Spencer, or like Sir Philip Sidney, like Shakespeare, like Ben Jonson, they had already possessed such sensibilities. Eliot gives concrete illustration to show that such unification of sensibility, such fusion of thought and feeling is to be found in the poetry of Donne and other metaphysical poets, but it is lacking in the poetry of Tennyson, Browning and the romantic poets. Here one more point, T.S. Eliot appreciated the metaphysicals. T.S. Eliot appreciated the Elizabethans, but T.S. Eliot criticizes Browning, criticizes Tennyson and other romantics. These poets did not have the same sensibility that were possessed by Elizabethans and metaphysicals. Alright. After Donne and Herbert, a change came over English poetry. The poets lost their capacity of uniting thought and feeling. The unification of sensibility was lost and dissociation of sensibility came into being. Alright, up clear now? Unification of sensibility and dissociation of sensibility. Right? Thought and feeling. What is more important in poetry? And in the essay, The Metaphysical Poets, once again, T.S. Eliot says that 18th century poetry was the poetry of thought. 18th century poetry, new classical poetry, was the poetry of thought. They used to think a lot and then used to write lines. For Wordsworth, poetry is feeling is the subject matter of poetry, emotion is the subject of matter of poetry. And when feeling and thoughts amalgamate, that is unification. And when they are separate, that is dissociation of sensibility. Alright, Tennyson and Browning are poets and they think, they do not feel. Tennyson and Browning are poets and they think, but they do not feel their thought as immediately as the odor of a rose. A thought to them was an experience. That is very important quotation. कई बार पूछा भी जा चुका है. A thought to Donne was an experience. It modified his sensibility. When a poet's mind is perfectly equipped for its work, it is constantly amalgamating disparate experience. The ordinary man's experience is chaotic, irregular and fragmentary. ये fancy है. Ordinary man का experience है, that is chaotic, that is irregular and that is fragmentary. The latter falls in love or reads Spinoza, and these two experiences have nothing to do with each other. Ordinary man है, चाहे वो लव में हो, चाहे वो स्पिनोजा को फिलॉसफी को पढ़े, क्या फर्क पड़ता है? Or with the noise of the typewriter or the smell of cooking in the mind of the poet, these experiences are always forming a new whole. One who possesses fancy, उससे दुनिया से कोई लेना देना नहीं है, but one who has imagination can write anything. One who has sensibility, the poet has the sensibility, the mind of the poet. In the mind of the poet, these experiences are always forming new wholes. They are collected, they are gathered there, and then they are dissipated, they are diffused there, and they create something new. That is poetry, that is unification of sensibility. Alright. So, tradition and individual talent. What is tradition? What is individual talent? What is theory of impersonality? What is objective correlative? What is dissociation of sensibility? And what is association of sensibility? Now everything is fine from my side. If you have any doubt, if you have any confusion, if you have any problem, you can still raise your query through your comment box. You can write your message to me directly through my Telegram channel, right? And I'll come to you taking the answers, taking the responses to your query. Finally, one more slide where T.S. Eliot compares the metaphysical poets and modern poets. Right? T.S. Eliot compares metaphysical poets and modern poets, and for T.S. Eliot, both are the complex poets and both are good. Modern poetry as well as metaphysical poetry. Alright, Donne and other metaphysicals are in the direct current of English poetry, and the modern poets are their direct descendants. Modern poets उन्हीं के descendants हैं. This current flows direct from the Elizabethan age rightly up to the modern age. only, and unfortunately this continuity was broken for some time under the influence of Milton and Dryden, who are great masters of language but not of the soul. Milton and Dryden, they are the great master of language, no doubt, but they are not the master of soul. T.S. Eliot says that this continuation, right, Jiha, it is going on. It was interrupted for some time during the time of Milton and John Dryden, though they were the great poets of thought, great poets of language, but they were poets without soul. The poet has different faculties and sensibilities. He must achieve a unification of his sensibilities and must express this unified sensibility in his poetry. Only such a poetry would be complete, but it would be complex and difficult. The metaphysicals as well as the moderns have this complexity and also this completeness and maturity. And initially क्या कहा था टी.एस. एलियट ने कि मेटाफिजिकल्स वर मैच्योर पोएट्स, मॉडर्न पोएट्स आर आल्सो मैच्योर, और अगर इसी ग्राउंड पर देखें तो मिल्टन एंड ड्राइडन वर नॉट मैच्योर पोएट्स, राइट? दे वर मेन ऑफ लैंग्वेज बट दे वर नॉट मेन ऑफ सोल्स. एंड पोएट्री क्या है? पोएट्री इज द वॉइस ऑफ सोल. ऑलराइट, सो दैट्स ऑल फॉर टुडे. That's all for T.S. Eliot's criticism. T.S. Eliot as a critic, I complete him here. If any doubt persists, I'll be waiting for your responses. Thank you. All the best. Keep on following the channel, the New Lyceum for English Literature, for all your queries related to literature, right? For all your queries related to your UGC NET examination, for any examination that is conducted in English literature, whether you are preparing for CUET entrance examination for your postgraduate, whether you are preparing for PhD entrance examination, NET examination, SET examination, or any other state's examination, you are free. You can join the channel, you can watch these videos, and these videos must help you clear your exam. This is my confidence. ऑल द बेस्ट. लाइक करिएगा, शेयर करिएगा और कमेंट बॉक्स में कमेंट जरूर लिखिएगा. इंतजार रहेगा मुझे. बाय बाय, टेक केयर, गुड लक.